Good evening. The Lord be with you. I want to lift up just a couple of verses that are within a portion of the scripture that Pastor Hartman read. Hebrews 12, verse 18. You have not come to something that can be touched. A blazing fire, darkness, gloom, tempest. Verse 22. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to the innumerable angels in festal gathering. Verse 24. And to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant. Hang on to those verses in the context of that portion of Scripture from the 12th chapter of Hebrews, if you will, for just a bit. And let me tell you about some fun I've been having for 10 years or so. I've been having some fun with colleagues and friends who are Baptists. And if there are any Baptists in the room tonight, I hope we can have a little fun together too. You see, their denomination, to which I refer, the Southern Baptist Convention, seems to have stopped growing. After increasing in membership for years, the Southern Baptist Convention seems to have reached a plateau and seems to have started a decline. As I have said and suggested, that is what the data appear to show. But their statistics are notoriously imprecise, because it's been my experience, and I've had a few Baptists admit it, that when people leave one Baptist congregation to join another, the new church counts the additions to the membership roll, but the former church does not quickly tally their departures as declines. So I tell my Baptist friends that Methodists keep much better statistics about membership. In other words, it may be true that both of our denominations are declining, but we Methodists have the numbers to prove it. So for those interested in data, we Methodists can demonstrate that we're in trouble. I guess we really have to admit that we're in trouble if we consider membership and worship attendance to be accurate measurements of church strength. Then we have to admit that our church is weakening. Our total denominational membership is now about 65% of what it was when the United Methodist Church was created by merger in 1968. If our denomination were a patient sitting on a physician's examination table for an annual physical, the doctor would look at the numbers from the lab reports and would conclude that the signs are clear. The poor patient is weakening. And if we needed any more evidence, we got plenty about 6 months ago, when a Pew Research study of Americans' attitudes toward religion was released, and for the first time in history, fewer than 50% of Americans identify themselves as Protestant. For the first time in the nation's history, nearly 20% of Americans, when asked about their religious affiliation, checked the box marked none. The fact that about 1 of every 5 Americans says none of the religious organizations in the country appeals to them has led social scientists, sociologists, cultural anthropologists to create a new category for these fellow citizens. They are called nuns. Not N-U-N-S, like Roman Catholic sisters in a religious order, N-O-N-E-S, nuns. Nuns are the people who say none of the nation's religious organizations merits their affiliation. These statistics have sent denominational leaders including the leaders of the United Methodist Church, into a state of near panic. Every Methodist meeting that I've attended in the last couple of years, no longer, more years than that, every one of the meetings is occupied almost obsessively with a search for plans that will get us to regain our strength. Pastors in conferences all across the country, not all conferences, but in many conferences across the country, are now required every Monday to log onto a software site called Dashboard, where they are required to enter the data for the previous Sunday, the previous day, showing what the worship attendance was and how many new members they received on profession of faith. Every time a committee meets, the conversation involves our declining numbers and our decreasing strength. Now, I'm happy to report that there are at least a few people who have a sense of humor about these things. I heard, for example, a projection that at the present rate of decline, in 100 years, the Presbyterian Church will consist of 3 members. And those 3 members will be the richest people in the country. But most church leaders find no reason to smile when they look at the data. There's a sense of crisis among many, if not most, bishops, denominational executives, district superintendents, and not a few deans of theological schools. And people have panicked. And when people panic, they grasp at all sorts of ideas for salvaging the situation. So we have had proposals to reorganize church structure and proposals to do away with church structure. We've heard suggestions about making membership standards more rigorous, and we've had proposals about making membership standards less rigorous. We've been told that our pastors should preach more, and we've been told that our pastors should preach less. We're debating whether preachers should move more often or less often. We've heard that theological education for ministry should be more demanding, and we've heard it should be less demanding. Consultants have been brought into the picture. They've offered advice about everything, such as changing the church music, altering what worship leaders wear for worship, and even whether cell phones should be turned off during the sermon so as not to interrupt the preacher, or turned on during the sermon so worshipers could tweet messages to the preacher about where he or she is falling short during the sermon. Now, I know our membership is declining. I know our worship attendance is decreasing. I know our Christian education programs are diminishing. So you and I know that by most measures, the United Methodist Church is losing its strength and is at the point of crisis. But one of the things that I have learned importantly through the years is that the worst thing to do in a crisis is panic. As the 12th chapter of the letter to the Hebrews reminds us, one of the great Old Testament stories concerns Jacob's twin brother Esau, who found himself at a point of crisis. After an unsuccessful day of hunting, he was feeling hungry. And the more he thought about feeling hungry, the hungrier he felt. And finally, he reached the point of panic. As the firstborn of twin brothers, Esau was older than Jacob. And in the culture of their time, the elder brother had enormous advantages over the younger brother. Esau, as the elder brother, had a right to 2/3 of the estate, for example, of their father's wealth. But that day when he came in from a bad time hunting, the hungrier he got, the more panicky he became. And finally, Esau panicked and sold his birthright and his right to an inheritance for 1 bowl of stew. He sacrificed his legacy because he decided he had to do something, anything, to cope with the emergency. And yet nobody ever resolved a crisis by surrendering to panic. Think of the Texan who piloted the U.S. Airways jet to a safe landing in the Hudson River a few years ago. It was made possible not only for the plane to land safely, but for everyone to make it safely out of the plane, simply because neither he as the pilot nor anybody else panicked. He'd flown water landings hundreds of times in a simulator. He knew what he had to do to take care of himself and to be disciplined and be ready for an emergency. He was strong enough to face the crisis because he prepared carefully long enough before the crisis ever hit. The discipline that one has established in one's life will prevent panic from having its way. But not all of us have been pilots, and few of us commercial pilots. Yet even those of us who've been just passengers know how important it is to take care of ourselves and not to panic in an emergency in the air. On every commercial flight, before a plane leaves the ground, flight attendants say that in an emergency, each passenger should take care of oneself before attending to anybody else. Scholars call that leadership by self-differentiation. That is, leadership means distinguishing oneself from the entanglements of the environment and the systems of panic in the surroundings. When a crisis hits, the worst thing a leader can do is get tangled up and twisted in the crisis. Step back from it. Focus on one's integrity. Establish one's own identity. Take care of yourself first. There's an old story about the late Roman Catholic Bishop Fulton J. Sheen, whom a few in this room are old enough to remember, at least as old as I am. He became, when he was Bishop of Rochester, New York, a rather popular media figure in the early days of television. Because of his fame, there were many people, and not only Roman Catholics, who sought him for advice. One pastor contacted Bishop Sheen after he heard Bishop Sheen in one of his programs say that it was vital for a church leader to spend 1 hour per day in prayer. So this pastor asked the bishop what to do in his own pastoral ministerial crisis. He said, "Bishop, I am burdened with problems beyond discussion. I have problems with personnel, I'm burdened with church budgets, and besides all that, I cannot find the time necessary to prepare a decent sermon." The preacher said, "Bishop, I'm overwhelmed with all these responsibilities, and now you tell me I need to spend 1 hour a day in prayer. Given the hardships of my ministry, I just can't see how this will work." Bishop Sheen said, "You're right. I don't know how you can manage all that and have 1 hour of prayer each day. You need 2 hours. We have people in the church, including important leaders in the church, who have decided that the situation is so dire that they have to do something. So that is what they do. Something. Anything. To help the rest of the church regain its strength. But how do we measure the strength of the church? The answer nowadays from people who are panicking seems to be that there are just 2 measures of strength. I will describe them in this way. The 2 measures of strength that most of the people who are panicking say we can only use to measure church strength are these: fannies and funds. How many fannies are seated on the cushions? And how many funds are flowing into the coffers? What's more, most of the panicky proposals seem to focus on the strength of very large membership congregations. It's as if local churches with 5,000 at worship are presumed to be stronger than local churches with 500 at worship, or 200, or 50. But that's the wrong message, and those are the wrong measures of strength. And I say that in part because of texts like the one read this evening from Hebrews, which says clearly that to keep the church strong, the only thing that we can use to measure the strength of the church is how we are motivated by our mission. Do we pursue peace with everyone? Do we make sure no one fails to obtain the grace of God? Do we avoid bitterness? Those are the measurements of a mission. There's nothing in those verses in Hebrews regarding fannies or funds. Nothing in those verses regarding numbers. The strength of the church is not measured by money or membership. The strength of the church is measured by mission. The strength of the church is measured by how much reconciliation we have achieved, how many barriers have been broken down, how much justice has been fostered, how many lives have been shown mercy. And I say that not just because I see it in Scripture, but also because of some observations about our two adult sons. When they were young, they were raised in the same Methodist parsonages. They went to the same Methodist Sunday schools. They even ate the same macaroni and cheese recipe out of the same blue box. Now they're both husbands and fathers, but their lives are completely different. One is a business executive who travels the world for his large corporate employer. The other is a public school teacher whose world is a small town and whose life is the theater. One is a conservative Republican who watches only Fox News. The other is a liberal Democrat who never watches Fox News. Both of them attend worship regularly. One worships with his family in an enormous congregation with a huge building complex that resembles a shopping mall, where on a typical Sunday, as many as 15,000 people attend its services. The other worships with his family in a small membership church where, on a typical Sunday, about 60 people attend its services. When we visit our sons and their families for weekends, we attend worship with them. When we visit the big church, the one that's like a shopping mall, we drive into the parking lot and volunteers are in the parking lot ministry to guide us to available spaces. We enter the building, walk along wide corridors to 2 auditoriums, and enter the one that still has seating available. In each of the auditoriums, a design team has constructed a visually appealing stage scene that is thematically linked to the message for the day. In each auditorium, a group of talented professional musicians performs. A message is delivered, but in one of the auditoriums, simulcast to the other auditorium on a huge screen. The children don't attend with us. They are in thematically structured classes in other parts of the shopping mall type building. When we visit the small church, sometimes we can drive if the weather's bad, but really we can walk along the rural road from our son and his family's home and just a little bit up the hill to the small church. Entering the sanctuary, there's no parking lot ministry. No wide corridors either. You walk through one door and you're in the sanctuary. There are usually a few volunteers there. They're the ones who, on that particular day, will be forming the choir. They're usually rehearsing hymn they're going to sing. The chancel area, the altar table, and the plastic greenery on the walls have probably been unchanged for years. Our 18-month-old granddaughter now accompanies the family. She's walking on her own these days, and so she moves up and down the side aisles, smiling at the church members, and they smile back at her. One day, maybe she'll come forward for the children's sermon. Now, here are my questions. which of these two churches exhibits strength? In which is a living faith in a living God through a living church being offered to a dying world? What measures shall we use to answer those questions? If we want to find the church that has strength, if we want to become a strong church again, should we strive to become like one of those churches or like the other one? Or like neither? Does one of them offer a model for renewing our strength? Here are my answers. Size doesn't matter. Mission is what matters. A church is strong if it is motivated by the pursuit of peace with everyone, if it is motivated by striving for holiness in the Lord, if it is motivated by a determination to share the grace of God with people everywhere. So how do we refocus our attention on mission and thereby regain our strength? Let's go back to the letter to the Hebrews, which urges us to do three things. First, the text tells us, lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees. The words are in the imperative mood. They echo an admonition that has both secular and sacred roots. The sources in the ancient world from which those phrases come are found both in the prophet Isaiah and in the Jewish philosopher from Egypt known as Philo. Philo said, people of faith must become like competitive athletes. In a contest or a struggle, Philo said, don't be weary athletes who droop their hands in weakness or yield to exhaustion, but strengthen your weak knees. Lift your drooping hands. Many times I've watched football games that have involved intense struggles between two evenly matched teams. They challenge each other back and forth across the field, challenge each other physically and ferociously until the players in the fourth quarter have begun to do this: put their drooping hands on their hips. And then between plays, they kneel down on one knee to rest their weak knees on the ground before the next play starts. The readers of the letter to the Hebrews knew plenty about great athletic contests in the Greco-Roman world, and they understood what the author was telling them when the author said, strengthen your weak knees, lift your drooping hands. The author was telling them, don't yield to the foes of faith. Don't shrink before a formidable antagonist. Don't surrender to a feeling of exhaustion. Lift your drooping hands. Strengthen your weak knees. Get back in the game. The apostle writing the letter to the Hebrews is like a coach demanding that we demonstrate the strength to sustain the struggle and pursue the victory. Of course, in saying all this, I realize that sports analogies don't work for everybody. So let me put it this way. If the world seems less interested in hearing the gospel of Jesus Christ than we think it should, the solution is not in scolding the world, but rather in strengthening ourselves. If some new generation seems to have decided that the power of prayer is waning, then the solution is not to join them in giving less attention to prayer, but in spending more time on our knees. If some of our neighbors seem to have acquired the impression that our hands are too droopy to help, then the solution is not in ignoring our neighbors, but in practicing some spiritual exercises of praise that cause us to lift our drooping hands and aid our weary neighbors. The only measurement of our strength that matters is the measure we take of the mission on which Christ sent us. Be strong for the sake of the world that Christ died to save. But it's not easy to be strong in the world in which we live. One of Perkins School of Theology's international students in recent years came to us as a middle-aged woman from Zimbabwe. Some of us are familiar with that southern African nation. Some of us know, perhaps many of us know, that for most of the time since the country emerged from the colonial identity it formerly had as Rhodesia, Zimbabwe has been ruled by an utter tyrant named Robert Mugabe. Our international student, the middle-aged woman from Zimbabwe, was a widow whose husband had been killed in one of the many conflicts waged by the Mugabe regime. Before she came to Perkins, she was working as a teacher, but really serving as a Methodist lay preacher. One Sunday night, before she traveled to Texas to study with us, when she was still at home in Zimbabwe, there was a knock at her door. A couple of men were standing there. They said, "Your presence is requested at the presidential office." Now, in the United States, such an invitation might be a cherished opportunity extended by the White House for us to go for a reception or dinner. But in Zimbabwe, such an invitation really means a summons to an interrogation, probably some time in prison, possibly a bit of torture, and occasionally a disappearance that may or may not mean death, but no one will ever find you again. When the knock came at the door and the men said what was requested of her, she had to be ready for anything. They hauled her from her home and took her to an interrogation room. They told her that it had come to her attention that earlier that day, Sunday morning, she had preached a sermon that could have been interpreted as critical of the government. They said to her, "We need you to explain what you said in that sermon." She said to them, "I don't explain sermons. I preach them." Then she added that she still had her sermon notes from the morning service in her bag, and that she would be glad to preach it again to them right then, right there. Stunned by her strength, they told her to do it. Preach that sermon right here, right now. So she did. Despite the sense of terror that might have made her hands droop too weakly to hold her notes, despite the terror that might have made her knees too weak to stand and preach, she delivered the sermon again. And when she was finished, the men left the room for a while. And when they returned, they told her she was free to go. The letter to the Hebrews says we need to strengthen ourselves in the faith. Lift our drooping hands, strengthen our weak knees, be disciplined and ready for a crisis or a contest, whenever it comes. That's the first message of the text from Hebrews for this evening, and here's the second. The 12th chapter of the letter to the Hebrews says that we have to make the paths straight for our feet. No matter how strong our knees might be, no matter how vigorously we've lifted our hands, if the pathways of the world are too harsh, the rough places in the road will cause even strong knees to buckle. Rebuilding the strength of the church is not simply having more Bible studies or engaging in more prayers or in being more personally disciplined about our private ways of behaving in the faith. It's also a matter of fixing the things that are broken or crooked in the world. The letter to the Hebrews says, make straight paths for your feet. Don't simply be strong when confronting a troubled world. Transform the troubled world. Fix its broken systems and its twisted paths. That, too, is the mission that measures our strength as a church, and it has been since Methodism began. Since our founding, we've had that dual mission at the core of our identity. When John Wesley first stated the mission and the purpose of the Methodist movement, he sent leaders as missionaries to reform the continent and to spread scriptural holiness over the land. One of the ways Methodism has done that through the last few hundred years is by building institutions for reforming and transforming the nation. We built hospital systems to provide care for the physically ill because reforming the continent required health care for all persons. We built child care institutions because the care of all God's children is necessary to structure and restructure society. We built colleges and universities, not just because we wanted better educated Methodists, but because we believe the entire nation would be better enhanced with better educated doctors, lawyers, teachers, and engineers, regardless of their religious tradition or no religious tradition at all. Make straight paths for your feet, says the letter to the Hebrews. Fix the pathways. Well, in our time, in today's America, that might even mean fixing the pathway to citizenship. Recently, I learned about a small two-year Methodist college in Georgia called Andrew College. It's a two-year school that offers an entry point to higher education for somebody who might not be able to reach SMU or afford Emory. A young woman who had graduated from high school wanted to go to college, but her pathway was blocked. Her immigrant parents had brought her to the United States illegally when she was a toddler. Most colleges were afraid to admit her. But this little Methodist college in Georgia decided to open its doors to her and offer her a place. They started fixing a pathway for her to study and for her to seek citizenship. She thrived as a student and earned her associate's degree. From there, she went to a university and earned a 4-year baccalaureate degree as a pre-med major. By then, the medical school at the University of Georgia decided they could admit her. So she's now graduated. She's now a physician practicing in Georgia and providing healing to people because a small Methodist college was motivated by the mission of the church to build a straight path for gifted women and men who were ready to serve regardless of their drooping hands, weak knees, or troubled pathways. That's the second admonition to us from the letter to the Hebrews. Fix the broken pathways of the world so the problems of the world will not make us lame again. And here's the third admonition in the letter to the Hebrews. Don't be impressed with the spectacular. The church that we attend with our older son may have 15,000 people at worship, state-of-the-art technology, superbly skilled musicians with powerful electronic amplifiers, and a gifted communicator to deliver the message. But when I sit there in the darkened auditorium, I feel as if I'm back at the writing stage of the letter to the Hebrews, being lured, enticed, invited to a blazing fire on a video screen, to a tempest stirred by musicians who are superbly talented, but are really putting on a religious show. And when I sit there, I know that something is missing. I cannot be saved by a spectacle. I can only be saved if I'm put in touch with the Spirit. So what if there's a blazing fire, a blaring trumpet, a foreboding gloom, or a forbidding storm on the big screen, on the big stage? The church finds strength when we're connected to the communion of saints, a chorus of angels, and the spirit of sacred righteousness in our covenant with God. That's our mission. And if we are motivated by it, we can weather any crisis. Any crisis. So let me tell you about one. And if you know it, it doesn't hurt to hear it again. In 1870, there was a man named Horatio Spafford who lived in Chicago with his wife and their 5 children. He was a lawyer and very successful in it. He'd made a lot of money, and he invested much of his wealth in real estate. In 1871, they had a son who died of an illness. A few months after the child's death, the Great Chicago Fire occurred. It destroyed most of the city, and Horatio Spafford lost most of his real estate assets. A financial disaster and a child's death are more than most of us could bear. The Spaffords decided to get away for a while. They decided to take their 4 remaining children on a cruise, on a voyage to Paris. At the last minute, because of new developments in the real estate matters, Mr. Spafford decided he needed to stay home and told his wife, Anna, and the girls, 4 girls, to go. During the journey, the ship was caught in a storm. It sank. Anna survived. The 4 girls were lost. When Anna reached a place to send a cable, she cabled her husband with 2 sentences: saved alone. What shall I do? While trying to imagine an answer to her, he began to write. But his words came out in verse. They began like this: when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. A decade later, Horatio and Anna Spafford, childless now, made a trip to Israel. They formed a Christian society known as the American Colony. It was planned as a place of refuge and spiritual healing. Later, this tragically childless couple added a children's medical center to the property. Through the years, the American Colony has endured. It has modified its activities, but its mission has remained the same: to be involved in transforming the world. 20 years ago, when representatives of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and the government of Israel negotiated what became known as the Oslo Peace Accords, the representatives of the Palestinians and the Israelis met at the American Colony Hotel. We can never know what crises will confront us. We can never know what source of strength will be required of us. But as long as we have in place the spiritual disciplines so that we're ready to lift our drooping hands, strengthen our weak knees, and make some broken pathways in the world straight, then we will enjoy the communion of the saints and the angels. And that is our mission. If we cannot offer that, then I don't blame the nuns for failing to come our way, nor do I fault those who are falling away from our membership. But if we can fulfill that mission, we will have the strength for the crises facing us, to care for the children, to straighten broken pathways, to strive for peace in the world. The haves and the have-nots, the nones and the sums will see it. They will know we are making a difference. And we and they together will be strong enough to sing in every adversity what I invite you to sing now at number 377 in the hymnal. All stanzas as we stand, as we are able. Number 377.